The world calls him a cold-blooded monster, but in Medellín, he is a living saint. Elderly citizens knelt in churches, clutching their rosaries to pray for the safety of this mass murderer named Pablo Escobar. Starving children hailed him as the Robin Hood of the Andes. He was deeply loved because he used his own illicit fortune to build thousands of sturdy brick homes, hospitals, and soccer fields for the severely impoverished people ignored by the state. To those at the absolute bottom of society, Escobar was a great savior. To the rest of the traumatized globe, he was the devil incarnate. The terrifying truth is that his charity was nothing more than a ruthless weapon of psychological manipulation. The exact same hand that gently fed starving orphans in Comuna 13 was more than willing to coldly sign thousands of death warrants. The most gruesome proof of this extreme brutality was the horrifying airborne slaughter of Avianca Flight 203. Merely to assassinate a presidential candidate, who never even boarded the plane, Escobar ordered a bomb planted next to the fuel tank, violently tearing the commercial airliner apart in the skies above Bogotá. 107 innocent passengers were instantly incinerated into ash and mangled flesh raining down on the streets. Escobar understood a fundamental, terrifying truth: absolute power requires absolute contradiction. The poorest classes willingly formed a massive human shield around him, completely blinded by the free houses, more than willing to entirely ignore the bullet-riddled corpses frequently dumped in the public gutters. The innocent blood of hundreds was completely washed clean in the eyes of his loyal followers by the red bricks of the homes he provided. He proved that a true monster does not need to hide in the shadows, he can walk boldly in the daylight, praised loudly by the very people whose nation he is systematically destroying piece by piece. The foundation of an international criminal empire is rarely built on sudden flashes of strategic brilliance. It is built in the gutters, forged through petty betrayals and an escalating, irreversible tolerance for human suffering. Long before the fleets of private jets, the exotic zoos, and the billion-dollar Caribbean cocaine routes, Pablo Emilio Escobar was just another hungry, sharp-eyed scavenger navigating the suffocating smog and lawless, unpaved alleys of 1970s Medellín. He did not start his career as an untouchable kingpin. He started as a common parasite feeding on the edges of society. His early, practical education in absolute ruthlessness began directly in the city's graveyards. Under the absolute cover of pitch-black darkness, a young Escobar and his trusted associates physically pried heavy marble tombstones from the damp earth, aggressively sanding down the deeply engraved names of the recently deceased to resell the blank slabs to grieving, completely unsuspecting families. It was a bleak, incredibly ghoulish trade that taught him a vital, chilling lesson: the dead have absolutely no use for respect, and the living will gladly pay for anything if they are desperate enough. This casual, daily desecration of the dead effectively stripped away his final, lingering layers of basic human empathy. From stealing tombstones, he rapidly escalated to stealing luxury cars, mastering the complex art of the quick, violent score and the immediate, untraceable payoff. But smuggling physical contraband across the highly porous, mountainous Colombian borders was where Escobar truly honed his apex predatory instincts. He aggressively moved untaxed cigarettes, cheap foreign electronics, and stolen, repainted vehicles through treacherous, heavily armed mountain passes. He actively learned the exact, unnegotiable price of a border guard's conscience. He learned that the national law was not an impenetrable wall, but a heavily rusted, poorly guarded gate that could easily be kicked completely open with the right amount of dirty cash. In this violent, subterranean economy, physical brutality was the only universally recognized currency, and Escobar was incredibly eager to aggressively mint his own. The true, irrevocable turning point, the exact moment the petty street thief mutated into a genuine, cold-blooded monster, occurred in the late summer of 1971. Escobar personally orchestrated the brazen kidnapping of Diego Echevarria Misas, a deeply unpopular, immensely wealthy local industrialist who perfectly symbolized the untouchable elite ruling class of Medellín. Escobar did not just want a lucrative ransom payment, he desperately wanted a permanent, terrifying reputation. He held the terrified, aging executive in a cramped, unventilated concrete cell, ruthlessly extracting the massive ransom money from Echevarria's desperate, weeping family. By all standard rules of the established criminal underworld, the illicit transaction was complete. The hostage should have been immediately released back to his estate. But Escobar operated on a vastly different, darker psychological frequency. He understood clearly that releasing Echevarria would only make him a wealthy, forgettable kidnapper. Killing him, however, would permanently transform him into a terrifying, unavoidable force of nature. He did not delegate the final, gruesome act to a subordinate. There was no grand, theatrical monologue, no philosophical justification for the impending murder. Escobar simply walked into the damp, windowless holding cell where the exhausted, weeping industrialist sat shivering in the dark. Without uttering a single word, he calmly raised a heavy-caliber revolver and put a single, deafening hollow-point bullet directly into Echevarria's skull. He coldly ordered his men to dump the still-bleeding corpse in a shallow, muddy ditch near a highly trafficked dirt road where it was absolutely guaranteed to be found. The local, highly lucrative smuggling economy of 1970s Medellín was heavily fragmented, tightly controlled by a loose, deeply paranoid network of older, established traffickers who fiercely guarded their territories. Among this older generation, Fabio Restrepo was a recognized, formidable heavy hitter, successfully moving substantial, highly profitable shipments of unrefined coca paste across the South American continent. When Escobar looked at Restrepo, he did not see a respected superior, a mentor, or a potential business partner. He saw nothing more than a temporary, fleshy obstacle currently holding his future inventory. Cocaine was no longer just a fringe, underground commodity, it was rapidly transforming into the most violently lucrative, blood-soaked export in modern human history, and Escobar fully intended to hold a permanent, absolute monopoly over the entire white powder pipeline. To violently seize the unseen throne of the underworld, he understood that he could not simply negotiate or slowly work his way up the established ranks. He had to demonstrate a sudden, overwhelming, and utterly predatory dominance. In the sweltering spring of 1975, Restrepo made the fatal, irreversible miscalculation of allowing the young, notoriously ambitious Escobar to personally handle a massive, high-stakes shipment of 14 kilograms of newly refined, pure cocaine. Restrepo foolishly assumed that the standard, unwritten rules of hierarchical criminal loyalty still applied to the younger generation. He fundamentally failed to recognize that the former tombstone scavenger had fully, irreversibly evolved into a merciless apex predator. The assassination was terrifyingly precise, flawlessly bloodless in its initial planning, and utterly devoid of human mercy. Restrepo was suddenly abducted in broad daylight by heavily armed, dead-eyed sicarios acting strictly under Escobar's explicit, unyielding orders. He was not interrogated for routes, nor was he tortured for hidden bank accounts, his existence was simply, abruptly erased from the world. His heavily bullet-riddled, bleeding body was unceremoniously discarded deep in the dense, suffocating brush of the rural Colombian countryside, left entirely to rot and be consumed by insects in the oppressive tropical heat. The actual, physical trigger man was completely irrelevant, the cold, invisible hand directing the fatal lead belonged exclusively to Pablo Escobar. What immediately followed the brutal assassination was a terrifying masterclass in complete psychological subjugation. Escobar did not anxiously hide in the chaotic aftermath, nor did he frantically attempt to cover his bloody tracks. Instead, he boldly and immediately summoned Restrepo's entire, deeply terrified operation, the hardened sicarios, the seasoned smugglers, the nervous money launderers, to a heavily guarded, deeply claustrophobic rural compound. He sat absolutely still, incredibly calm at the head of a long wooden table, closely flanked by his own men holding heavy, fully automatic assault weapons. The still air in the room was thick with the foul scent of cheap tobacco and absolute, paralyzing human fear. He stared blankly at the hardened men who had, just days prior, sworn unshakable, lifelong allegiance to Fabio Restrepo. He did not yell, scream, or openly threaten them with immediate, gruesome death. His voice was terrifyingly flat, bare, and emotionless, barely a raspy whisper over the mechanical hum of the overhead ceiling fans. He simply informed them, as if discussing the weather, that their former boss was permanently gone, and that his vast organization, his hidden routes, and his entire life's work now belonged exclusively to him. He casually offered them a stark, binary choice. They could seamlessly transition their absolute loyalty to his emerging cartel and become unimaginably wealthy, or they could rapidly join Restrepo in the muddy, fly-infested ditches. He slowly slid a thick, heavy stack of crisp American $100 bills across the scarred wooden table, immediately followed by the heavy, metallic thud of a loaded 9mm pistol. The seasoned criminal stared paralyzed at the massive cash and the cold gun. The suffocating, deafening silence of the sweltering room was broken only by the sound of heavy, panicked breathing. Slowly, one by one, trembling, calloused hands reached out across the table and took the bloody money. The localized, street-level violence of the Medellín criminal underworld was merely a brutal rehearsal for the unprecedented bloodbath that Escobar was about to unleash upon the entire sovereign Republic of Colombia. Having successfully secured absolute, unchallenged control over the sprawling international cocaine supply lines, his illicit wealth rapidly mutated from mere millions into untraceable, staggering billions. He casually bought ambitious politicians, entirely funded corrupt local police departments, and effectively purchased his own heavily armed, private mercenary army. But true, unassailable power requires significantly more than just infinite capital, it requires absolute, permanent impunity. Escobar formally codified his terrifying reign with three simple, inescapable words: plata o plomo. Silver or lead. Take the generous bribe, or take a hollow-point bullet. This terrifying, binary doctrine systematically and brutally dismantled the entire Colombian justice system. Honorable magistrates who bravely refused his blood money quickly found their innocent families brutally targeted by masked sicarios. Honest, overworked police officers were routinely gunned down at busy traffic lights by emotionless teenagers riding pillion on fast dirt bikes. Dedicated investigative journalists who dared to boldly print his name alongside the forbidden word /cartel/ had their entire publishing offices violently reduced to smoking, pulverized craters of concrete and twisted steel. Escobar brilliantly weaponized the common hitman, turning desperate, starving youths from the forgotten slums into an inexhaustible, highly disposable army of ruthless assassins. He openly placed a massive standing cash bounty on the head of every single uniformed police officer in Medellín, completely turning the city streets into a chaotic, open-air hunting ground where fresh blood constantly slicked the hot pavement. But the true, irreversible escalation, the exact moment Escobar formally declared open, total war against the sovereign state, was triggered by a single man of unbending, exceptional integrity. Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, the newly appointed, fearless Minister of Justice, publicly and aggressively exposed Escobar not as a benevolent populist hero, but as a parasitic, murderous narco-trafficker. Lara Bonilla relentlessly spearheaded the successful dismantling of Tranquilandia, a massive, hidden jungle cocaine laboratory complex, striking a devastating, multi-million-dollar financial blow directly to the beating heart of the cartel's operations. He adamantly refused the silver. Therefore, he was absolutely guaranteed the lead. Escobar did not simply order a quiet, discreet assassination, he ordered a brutal, highly visible public execution explicitly meant to permanently paralyze the entire national government. In the fading, heavy twilight of April 30, 1984, Lara Bonilla's heavily armored white Mercedes was slowly navigating the congested, evening traffic of Bogotá. The minister sat rigidly in the back seat, a physically exhausted man acutely, painfully aware that his days were strictly numbered. Suddenly, a roaring red Yamaha motorcycle abruptly pulled closely alongside the targeted vehicle. The young assassin riding pillion did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He smoothly raised a heavy MAC-10 submachine gun and unleashed a deafening, sustained torrent of heavy .45 caliber rounds directly through the reinforced passenger glass. The heavy, metallic slugs easily tore through the heavy armor plating, instantly shredding Lara Bonilla's chest, throat, and neck. The panicked driver frantically swerved, violently slamming the bullet-riddled vehicle into the rigid concrete barrier, but it was already far too late. As the distant sirens wailed and the frantic bodyguards desperately pulled the bleeding, lifeless minister from the shattered glass and twisted metal, Escobar was hundreds of miles away in his luxurious, heavily fortified sanctuary, Hacienda Nápoles. He sat silently in the oppressive humidity by the edge of his pristine swimming pool, calmly and methodically feeding bloody chunks of raw meat to his imported, exotic animals in the fading tropical light. Escobar's unyielding, bloody campaign of domestic terrorism reached a truly apocalyptic crescendo not in the distant, forgotten slums, but directly in the beating, historic heart of the Colombian capital. The single greatest, most terrifying existential threat to the vast Medellín cartel was not the heavily outgunned local police, nor the deeply corrupted national politicians, it was the looming, irreversible specter of the newly signed extradition treaty with the United States government. Facing the absolute, terrifying certainty of slowly decaying in a sterile, maximum security American federal prison, Escobar required a violent solution that was entirely unprecedented in its sheer, psychotic audacity. He desperately needed to physically, permanently erase the massive legal evidence meticulously gathered against him. To achieve this impossible task, he forged an unholy, strictly transactional alliance with the M-19, a heavily armed, radical left-wing guerrilla insurgency. It was a terrifying, pragmatic merger of limitless, illicit narco-capital and highly trained, ideologically driven Marxist militants. Escobar aggressively provided the M-19 with immense, untraceable cash funding and high-grade, smuggled weaponry. In direct return, the hardened guerrillas eagerly provided the specialized, suicidal manpower absolutely necessary to orchestrate a massive, highly coordinated, military-style assault on the Palace of Justice in downtown Bogotá. On the deceptively bright morning of November 6, 1985, a heavily armed, tactical column of M-19 guerrillas violently stormed the Supreme Court building. They aggressively bypassed security and immediately took over 300 terrified civilians, prominent lawyers, and the highest-ranking Supreme Court justices completely hostage. The heavily fortified building, the absolute symbol of national law, was instantly transformed into a claustrophobic, blood-soaked, chaotic war zone. The Colombian military, deeply humiliated and violently enraged by the incredibly brazen assault, responded with overwhelming, entirely indiscriminate lethal force. They aggressively rolled heavy armored military tanks directly up the pristine marble steps, blasting massive, gaping holes right through the ornate stone facades, rapidly turning the historic internal courtyards into brutal, inescapable killing fields. Deep inside the dark, smoke-filled, heavily besieged corridors, the true, primary objective of the guerrilla death squad was systematically and ruthlessly executed. As heavy artillery shells continuously rocked the concrete foundations and terrified hostages rapidly bled out on the shattered marble floors, the M-19 fighters systematically hunted down the specific, heavily guarded archives containing the highly sensitive extradition files. They aggressively gathered thousands of irreplaceable legal documents, sworn witness testimonies, and sealed, devastating indictments meticulously built against Pablo Escobar and the other leading cartel bosses. The horrific siege lasted for 28 agonizing, deafening hours, finally concluding in a chaotic, towering inferno of unimaginable national devastation. Over 100 innocent people lay dead amidst the smoking rubble, including 11 prominent, irreplaceable Supreme Court justices who were brutally executed in the relentless crossfire. The majestic, historic building was entirely reduced to a blackened, structurally compromised, continuously smoldering ruin. The collective national psyche of Colombia was permanently, deeply fractured, staring directly into the abyss of a fully realized narco-state. Hundreds of miles away, completely hidden deep within a heavily guarded, heavily fortified rural safe house, Escobar received the final, awaited confirmation over an encrypted, shortwave radio frequency. He did not openly celebrate the massacre. He did not crack a triumphant smile. He simply sat motionless in the heavy, suffocating silence of the room, calmly listening to the rhythmic static of the radio, as the massive, towering stacks of legal extradition files continuously burned in the ruined heart of Bogotá, curling into entirely useless, fragile black ash that drifted slowly over the mutilated, unrecognized corpses of the highest judges in the entire land. Despite the unprecedented, unimaginable bloodshed staining the entire nation, the fractured Colombian state realized it could not militarily defeat Pablo Emilio Escobar. The sheer, overwhelming volume of relentless cartel violence had completely exhausted the paralyzed national government, violently forcing them to the humiliating negotiating table with a prolific mass murderer. Operating from a position of absolute terror, Escobar offered them a deeply humiliating, entirely unprecedented compromise. He would voluntarily surrender to authorities and permanently cease the relentless, devastating car bombings, but only if the desperate government formally and legally outlawed extradition to the United States. Furthermore, he would serve his reduced time in Colombia, entirely within a specialized prison designed, fully funded, and privately built exclusively by him. The sovereign state, completely broken, bleeding, and desperate for a fragile ceasefire, officially agreed to his dictatorial terms. In the heavy rain of June 1991, Escobar formally surrendered to helpless authorities and was personally escorted by armed military helicopters to La Catedral, an imposing, heavily fortified fortress perched high in the misty, dense mountains overlooking his loyal hometown of Medellín. It was officially designated by the cowardly government as a maximum security federal penitentiary. In harsh reality, it was a hyper-luxurious, totally impregnable mountain resort designed specifically to protect the wealthy kingpin from his heavily armed rival enemies while easily allowing him to fiercely maintain absolute, unyielding control over his global cocaine empire. La Catedral proudly featured a pristine, full-sized soccer field, a towering artificial waterfall, a massive industrial kitchen manned by imported professional chefs, and a sprawling, multi-level entertainment complex frequently featuring smuggled, high-priced prostitutes. The heavily armed guards aggressively patrolling the towering perimeter fences were not actual state employees, they were Escobar's own highly paid, loyal sicarios, merely wearing official government uniforms to maintain the pathetic, transparent illusion of lawful incarceration. From the expansive wooden balcony of his lavishly decorated master suite, peering through a high-powered, military-grade telescope, Escobar could comfortably watch the distant, glittering city he still completely and ruthlessly controlled. His supposed, highly publicized imprisonment was the ultimate, humiliating, historical mockery of the entire Colombian justice system. But absolute, unchecked isolation rapidly breeds absolute, crippling paranoia. Safely locked within the incredibly thick, heavily fortified walls of La Catedral, Escobar quickly began to violently suspect his oldest, most trusted lieutenants of aggressively skimming massive cartel profits and secretly cooperating with deadly rival factions. The sheer, staggering magnitude of his illicit wealth had made him deeply, irrevocably suspicious of the very men who had helped him violently build it. In the sweltering heat of July 1992, he abruptly summoned Fernando Galeano and Gerardo Moncada, two of his highest-ranking, most financially successful commanders, directly to the remote mountain fortress for a highly private meeting. They confidently arrived entirely unarmed, genuinely believing they were simply bringing their respected boss his required monthly cash tribute. They were violently dragged directly into the damp, unlit subterranean tunnels deep beneath the luxury suites. There was absolutely no criminal trial, no desperate opportunity for negotiation. Escobar coldly accused them of brazenly stealing millions from the organization. He did not order a quick, clean, merciful execution. Instead, he stood silently in the suffocating darkness, watching coldly as his loyal sicarios brutally and methodically tortured his oldest, wealthiest friends, deliberately shattering their bones and slowly burning their flesh. When the agonizing, echoing screams finally ceased and the bloody, gruesome work was entirely finished, Escobar casually ordered their heavily mutilated bodies to be rapidly dismembered and immediately incinerated in the prison's massive, industrial garbage incinerator. The incredibly thick, foul-smelling black smoke from the burning human corpses drifted lazily out of the stone chimney of La Catedral, casting a dark, greasy, unforgettable shadow over the otherwise pristine, freezing mountain air. Pablo Emilio Escobar was not a solitary, isolated monster operating in a societal vacuum. A single kingpin absolutely cannot successfully terrorize an entire, heavily armed nation without the active, incredibly enthusiastic participation of tens of thousands of willing enablers. His unprecedented, terrifying empire was deeply, irrevocably anchored in a completely compromised society that had willingly and actively surrendered its collective moral compass in direct exchange for thick stacks of dirty American dollars. The true, underlying horror of the vast Medellín cartel was not simply the staggering volume of its refined cocaine, but the absolute, terrifying normalization of extreme violence as a completely legitimate, highly respected career path. The physical backbone of this terrifying, deeply ingrained narco-culture was the sicario, the disposable teenage hitman. In the desperately impoverished, steeply terraced slums of Medellín, universally known as the violent comunas, Escobar was absolutely not viewed as a criminal, he was the sole, undisputed economic provider. The legitimate government offered nothing but crushing, inescapable poverty, while Escobar offered instant, seemingly unimaginable wealth. Calloused boys as young as 13 willingly abandoned their rotting, underfunded public schools to eagerly and proudly join the growing ranks of his private, heavily armed mercenary army. They were casually handed high-caliber, imported revolvers, incredibly fast dirt motorcycles, and thick wads of uncounted cash. These teenagers were not brainwashed victims, they were completely rational, calculating economic actors operating successfully in a brutal system where human life was impossibly cheap and sudden death was immensely profitable. A macabre, deeply disturbing, and highly religious subculture rapidly evolved around this massive industry of contract murder. Young, dead-eyed assassins would routinely visit local, incredibly crowded Catholic churches right before a targeted hit, earnestly and devoutly praying to the Virgin Mary for a steady, unwavering hand and a clean, untraceable escape. Desperate, impoverished mothers proudly pinned cheap religious scapulars directly to the inside of their teenage sons' leather jackets, fully aware that the young boy was immediately riding off to aggressively gun down a completely innocent, overworked police officer for a massive $2,000 cash bounty. The vast rivers of blood money flowed relentlessly from the highest cartel bosses directly down into the poorest, most desperate neighborhoods, enthusiastically and openly laundered through local grocery stores, small auto repair shops, and rapid real estate development. The entire, sprawling metropolis became deeply, undeniably complicit in the ceaseless, daily slaughter. Even at the absolute highest echelons of federal power, the moral rot was complete and absolute. Senior judges routinely and quietly accepted thick, heavy briefcases of untraceable cash to conveniently and permanently misplace crucial, damning forensic evidence. Elite military commanders actively and treasonously leaked the exact, highly classified coordinates of rival cartel hideouts directly to Escobar's heavily armed death squads. Respected politicians publicly delivered impassioned, highly televised speeches aggressively decrying the horrific drug violence, while simultaneously depositing massive, multi-million-dollar cartel bribes into hidden, secure offshore bank accounts. Escobar had successfully, irrevocably proven that every single human being, from the starving, desperate slum orphan to the highest-ranking, heavily decorated military general, had an exact, easily calculable price. The ultimate, terrifying success of his complete psychological and economic manipulation was highly evident every single day on the bloody, chaotic streets of Medellín. It was no longer just the core cartel ruthlessly enforcing the binary law of plata o plomo. It was the average citizens themselves. When a heavily armed, uniformed police patrol was brutally ambushed and violently massacred by emotionless teenagers in a crowded, busy residential intersection, the local bystanders did not scream in horror or desperately call for medical help. They simply and quietly stepped right over the bleeding, deeply bullet-riddled corpses of the dying officers and calmly scavenged their standard-issue, loaded service weapons directly from the hot, blood-soaked asphalt. The horrific, sadistic murder of his own high-ranking lieutenants directly inside the walls of La Catedral instantly and violently shattered the delicate, manufactured illusion of national peace. The deeply embarrassed Colombian government, heavily facing immense, blistering international humiliation and intense pressure from the United States, finally ordered the military to forcefully transfer Escobar to a genuine, highly secure federal prison. But the untouchable kingpin simply bribed the heavily armed perimeter guards and casually walked out of the unguarded back gate directly into the freezing, dense Andean fog, instantly sparking the most massive, highly expensive, and heavily militarized manhunt in recorded human history. Escobar was completely and permanently stripped of his luxurious, sprawling mountain fortresses and endless amenities. He was abruptly and violently thrust back into the highly claustrophobic, deeply paranoid daily existence of a desperately hunted fugitive. The undisputed apex predator had officially and irreversibly become the terrified prey. The Colombian government aggressively mobilized the Search Block, a highly specialized, ruthlessly efficient tactical military unit heavily trained by the CIA and DEA, completely and exclusively dedicated to hunting down a single man. But the most terrifying, lethal threat to his survival did not wear a legitimate police uniform. The massive, violent vacuum of power quickly birthed the terrifying vigilante group known as Los Peeps, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar. Los Peeps was a ruthless, shadowy, highly organized death squad heavily funded by the billionaire rival Cali cartel, disgruntled former Medellín associates, and quietly backed by rogue American and Colombian intelligence agents. They deliberately did not operate within the agonizingly slow, restrictive constraints of international law. They operated strictly and brutally on the exact same bloody, merciless rules Escobar himself had established. If Escobar aggressively bombed a crowded civilian shopping mall, Los Peeps instantly retaliated by bombing his innocent mother's luxury apartment. If Escobar callously executed a uniformed police officer, Los Peeps immediately kidnapped, viciously tortured, and brutally executed his expensive lawyers, his trusted accountants, and his most feared, heavily armed sicarios. The relentless psychological and physical warfare was absolutely merciless. Los Peeps systematically and aggressively dismantled his entire, sprawling financial and logistical support network. They ruthlessly burned down his lavish, multi-million-dollar country estates, brutally slaughtered his prized, imported exotic animals, and casually dumped the heavily tortured, castrated corpses of his most fiercely loyal hitmen directly in the busy public squares of Medellín, frequently with heavily taunting, blood-soaked placards cruelly pinned to their mutilated, broken chests. The massive, seemingly impenetrable human shield of the local populace that had successfully protected Escobar for over a decade rapidly and completely evaporated. The absolute, unshakable loyalty previously bought with dirty silver was now entirely, pathetically useless against the imminent, terrifying, unavoidable threat of Hollow Point lead. Permanently confined to a rapid, chaotic succession of damp, increasingly modest and dirty safe houses, the world's most powerful, feared billionaire was suddenly reduced to a miserable, constantly hunted rat. The suffocating, crippling paranoia was absolute and inescapable. He could no longer safely use a standard telephone without the terrifying, paralyzing certainty that advanced American triangulating technology was rapidly closing in on his exact, highly vulnerable coordinates. He could not safely peer out of a heavily curtained window without deeply expecting a highly trained sniper's crosshairs directly on his skull. His terrified wife and young children were repeatedly rejected by foreign governments, effectively trapped in a heavily guarded, heavily fortified government hotel under the constant, terrifying threat of imminent assassination. In a freezing, unventilated, rotting safe house on the forgotten outskirts of Medellín, the once completely untouchable kingpin sat heavily huddled on a cheap, stained mattress. His vast, seemingly invincible billion-dollar empire had completely dissolved into useless, bloody dust. He shivered violently in the damp, unforgiving cold, nervously and tightly clutching a heavy, fully loaded Sig Sauer pistol, listening intently and breathlessly to the distant, aggressive, rhythmic chopping of the heavily armed military helicopters constantly circling the pitch-black sky directly above, feeling the cold, invisible noose tightening ever closer around his throat. The relentless, absolutely suffocating pressure of the international manhunt systematically and violently stripped Pablo Emilio Escobar of his seemingly impenetrable armor, leaving behind only a deeply exhausted, desperately paranoid father. By the bleak winter of December 1993, his sprawling, global billion-dollar criminal empire had been completely and pathetically reduced to a single, highly modest two-story brick house in an unremarkable, middle-class residential neighborhood of Medellín. His once massive, ruthless private army of thousands of heavily armed sicarios had been systematically slaughtered, permanently imprisoned, or aggressively bought off by the wealthy, rival Cali cartel. His absolute only remaining companion was Alvaro de Jesus Agudelo, a fiercely loyal but heavily outgunned, exhausted bodyguard universally known as /El Limón / the once untouchable kingpin who had casually ordered the complete, fiery destruction of fully loaded passenger airliners was now completely paralyzed, entirely cornered like a wounded animal within the very heart of his own city. The ultimate, fatal mistake was not violently born of his trademark strategic arrogance, but of profound, crippling psychological fatigue. On the overcast afternoon of December 2nd, exactly one day after his miserable 44th birthday, Escobar abruptly broke his own strict, lifelong survivalist protocol. Desperately craving to speak with his stranded, terrified family, he foolishly made a significantly prolonged, completely unsecured radio telephone call to his teenage son, Juan Pablo. He absolutely knew the devastating, lethal risks. He knew exactly that the highly advanced, heavily funded American triangulation technology operated aggressively by the CIA and DEA was constantly and relentlessly sweeping the local airwaves. But the crippling, agonizing isolation had finally and permanently overridden his legendary, cold-blooded discipline. Within mere minutes of formally establishing the fragile audio connection, the highly trained Colombian search block accurately pinpointed his exact, vulnerable physical location. The silent, heavily armed tactical assault units rapidly and aggressively converged on the quiet, unsuspecting residential street, completely and flawlessly sealing off all possible terrestrial escape routes. They deliberately did not attempt to negotiate a peaceful, orderly surrender. They did not issue standard, mandated warnings over loud, booming loudspeakers. The heavily armored military operatives simply and violently kicked in the heavy wooden front doors and immediately unleashed a massive, deafening, unyielding torrent of heavy automatic gunfire directly into the dark ground floor. El Limón was violently and instantly gunned down in the chaotic, frantic opening seconds of the brutal military raid, his frail body violently shredded by dozens of high-velocity assault rifle rounds as he desperately and hopelessly attempted to secure a defensive firing position. Hearing the deafening, overwhelming gunfire erupting directly beneath him, Escobar frantically scrambled towards the absolute only remaining exit. The immensely wealthy man who had once privately built hyper-luxurious palaces was now pathetically reduced to scrambling frantically through a small, dusty, elevated back window, completely barefoot, desperately clutching his heavy, loaded Sig Sauer pistol. He miraculously managed to heave his heavy frame onto the sloping, red terracotta roof of the adjoining suburban house. But the entire physical perimeter was absolutely swarming with heavily armed, highly trained search block operatives with their weapons firmly raised. As Escobar desperately and awkwardly sprinted across the slippery, uneven roof tiles, the seasoned soldiers below immediately opened sustained, accurate fire. He was violently struck repeatedly in the lower torso and the upper leg, the heavy, metallic impacts violently and instantly knocking his heavy body down hard onto the rough, unforgiving clay. The final, definitive fatal shot did not come from a dramatic, highly cinematic, drawn-out showdown. It was a single, devastating, high-caliber bullet that cleanly and violently entered directly through his right ear, instantly and completely destroying his brain before abruptly exiting the other side of his shattered skull. The once undisputed, terrifying king of global cocaine violently collapsed heavily onto his side, his thick, warm blood rapidly and aggressively pooling on the dirty red tiles. The heavily armed, adrenaline-fueled soldiers immediately swarmed the sloping roof, excitedly and proudly posing for grinning, historical photographs directly over his bleeding, barefoot, and utterly broken corpse. The bullet that shattered Pablo Escobar's skull did not miraculously cure the deeply traumatized nation of Colombia. It simply transferred the unimaginable, bloody wealth of the Medellín cartel into the eager, waiting hands of the rival Cali cartel, seamlessly continuing the catastrophic cycle of extreme narco-violence. Escobar left behind a deeply fractured society where entire generations had been aggressively conditioned to view brutal murder as a highly viable, lucrative economic strategy. Even his massive, abandoned estate, Hacienda Napoles, slowly rotted into the jungle, leaving behind a bizarre, dangerous legacy, a rapidly multiplying herd of invasive African hippopotamuses aggressively terrorizing the local river systems. There was no grand, satisfying moral victory achieved on that bloody red roof. The king of cocaine was dead, his mutilated body buried deep in the damp earth, but the vast, terrifying empire of blood and white powder he violently constructed continued to function flawlessly, efficiently feeding the world's endless, insatiable chemical hunger.